some lighting, some theory about lighting, some background into lighting, and some of the technical and aesthetic codes to be thinking about in terms of lighting. So, photographers like to think of lighting as their medium or their canvas. In fact, everything we do is related to light. Without light, none of this works. It creates the hues we can see in a colour photograph and the tones we see in black and white, and indeed creates the form and shape that we can apprehend. So a photographer must understand the properties of light in order to effectively realise their ideas in image. Or at least it's very useful to. If you can understand the key properties of light and how it works, you then understand the tools that you're working with, if you like. You understand the medium better. And you can better take advantage of the various different types of illumination, and you can start thinking about the way in which light generates meaning for others, the way that light has the capacity to generate meaning ideas for others in communication. Well, what is light? Just very quickly, it's electromagnetic radiation. Primary source is the sun. In fact, in photography, the sun is regarded as the starting point as far as light's concerned, and often you'll see light reflected in measurements, or reflected, or graded, or put into charts and so on, or divided up or categorised. And daylight sunlight is usually, nearly always, the base point, the starting point. Electromagnetic radiation, well, light's actually just really a small part of that, of the total electromagnetic radiation coming from the sun. And there's other types of light that we can't see that is beyond, outside of the bandwidth that we can see. Things like ultraviolet, infrared and X-ray. And they provide other forms of other areas of photography as well. So if we had to think of an entire range of light, it would look something like this. It's visible light just represents this small part of the entire spectrum of electromagnetic radiation. And you can see there's other things along there too, like infrared, microwave and radio. Then up this end there's ultraviolet, X-ray and gamma ray. And in fact, I think I heard the analogy once, if you took a roll of movie film and stretched it from Los Angeles to San Francisco, then the visible, and that represented electromagnetic radiation, then the visible part would represent one 35mm frame. So it's pretty small. We've already seen that cameras have exposure limitations due to lens technology and format sensitivity and the problems with dynamic range, but we can use and manipulate light to create exposure effects, depth of field, motion blur and freeze motion. So that's some of the techniques that we've learnt already. But we can also use light to create visual communication effects. And what we're talking about here essentially is a semiotic, a library of meaning, if you like, that already exists in the world that we can tap into and use to create meaning in our own photographs. In other words, the people who are viewing our photographs, other people, they already have a visual literacy that allows them to read photographs in a certain way and allows them to read the world in a certain way. And that is brought to the photographs, and we can use that. Understanding that helps us to create meaning in our and effects in our photographs. So we can think of things like depth, stylization, naturalism, mood and meaning. Fundamentally, there's four properties of light that are commonly identified: intensity, direction, quality and colour. And we'll have a look at those individually. So let's talk about intensity first of all. It's a relative term and literally means the strength of light. The strength of the power of the light, if you like. That's not necessarily the same as the strength of the, it's not necessarily the same as the exposure that's created by that particular light, but the strength of the light itself. It's a relative term, and it weakens with distance according to something called the inverse square rule. And what that means is, in a nutshell, without going into the maths, a very small movement in a light will create a big difference in the amount of exposure, or the strength of that light, or the intensity of that light. And it's applied through something called the inverse square rule. So, for instance, if you moved, if you had a light at 1 metre from your subject, and then you moved it to 2 metres, you might think that the light might halve in strength, because it's going from 1 metre to 2 metres. But in actual fact, it's going down to a quarter. Right? 1 divided by 2 squared, 1/4, inverse square rule. If you're going from 1 metre to 3 metres, it's not being divided by a third. The strength of light is not being reduced by a third. It's actually going down to a ninth. 1 divided by 3 squared. So you can see small changes in distance of the light to the subject create a big change in the strength of or intensity of that light. This is something that is not immediately apparent until you start working with lights. But let's look at some of the ways we can manipulate intensity. Well, we can change the size or power of the light source. We can get a bigger light, or we can turn the light up if it has that capacity, turn the strength up. We can change the distance of the light to the subject, and I've just said that doing that has a big difference in terms of the power or the intensity. We can put filtration on the lights, things like neutral density filters or other forms of scrim or other forms of filtration. We can reflect light off surfaces instead of shining the light directly. We can bounce the light off a surface, and that will radically reduce the intensity of the light. And we can add or remove the numbers of lights in a scenario from a particular direction. So it's changing the quantity of light source. And when we change the quantity, when we change the intensity of light, there's two styles of lighting that we can create. We can create high key, which is sort of very low contrast sort of light, and then we can also have low key. This is an example of low key lighting here. Property 2 is direction. Of course, light can come from any direction, 360 degrees, front, side, back, low or high. But the sun, as I was saying before, is our starting point, if you like. It's the light that we've evolved under. It's the light that we regard as natural. It's the light that that we're most used to. So quite often, photographers or using lighting, we're doing something to recreate the look of sunlight, or the ambient of sunlight, or a particular type of sunlight. Now, it just so happens we've evolved under one sun. Say, for instance, we've evolved under 3 suns, we might be developing a different semiotic or different lighting ideas with our artificial lighting. But no, we have one sun, so we're typically looking to create light that emulates that with one shadow, a main single source, what's known as a main key light. So this guides our development of mood and interpretations, because this is what's known, this is what our audience already knows, and this is what we can use and tap into. So we can change the direction of a light source, we can move the light's position, we can move our subject's position, or we can begin reflecting light. Okay, well, quite straightforward if we think about it in those terms. But direction is very important in terms of developing different styles and ideas. We had a go with flash this week. Did everybody do their flash exercise? Yeah. And because we were using on-camera flash, built-in pop-up flash, that's an example of frontal light. And as you probably saw, it tends to provide a flat, shadow alleviating sort of light. And here's an example of, this is not necessarily a on-camera flash, but it's this front lighting. It's that straight ahead sort of lighting that's directly behind the lens or very close to the lens. Tends to flatten out all shadows and produces a flat type of look. When I say flat, I mean it doesn't produce three-dimensionality. It doesn't create the idea of three-dimensionality. It's a very common lighting style for sort of glamour and magazine cover type looks because it is so shadow alleviating. And shadows create ideas of whether they accentuate any imperfections, and that's typically not what's required in this sort of image. We also see a lot of this kind of on-camera flash type shots. This is perhaps the type of shot of someone who is just using an automatic pop-up flash and got that kind of rather rude and ugly frontal lighting shot with the shiny reflections and so on straight back into the lens. Side lighting, there's a couple of examples here by Yusuf Karsh. Anybody who's interested in doing any portrait work as part of their portfolio, or indeed as part of their narrative work, might could do far worse and have a look at Yusuf Karsh's brilliant portrait work. And he typically used side lighting because, well, particularly with these style shots, he's kind of low-key, high contrast images. It's, as opposed to the frontal lighting, it has the ability to create three-dimensionality. Has the ability to emphasize depth and form and shape and create the idea of three-dimensionality when in fact there isn't any. This is a two-dimensional format photography. So this is something that can be read into the image by our viewers, our audience. And there's a semiotic attached to this type of imagery too, particularly in the low key style here that Karsh is using, with the high contrast. That is high contrast between the light areas and the dark areas. When I say high contrast, I mean that there's a big difference. There's an extreme, at the extreme ends of the tonal range combined in one photograph. Whereas high key tends to have low contrast. Alright, so this is a low key version, and you can see that there's very bright highlights. It really accentuates every little wrinkle, every little shape, even the cigarette smoke is highlighted. There's highlights all across the top of the fingers and so on, and then it very quickly drops into shadow. And that's a characteristic of this low-key look, is that there is this very quick drop-off, very quick transition between the highlights and the dark areas. And it has this semiotic of seriousness, classic, ruggedness, it tends to build the ideas of character and so on. Window light is often used as an excellent side lighting source. Particularly a dirty window if you can get it, because it tends to spread the light a little bit more, make the light a little bit softer. Of course, this is not new to photography. This is all these lighting styles have been explored in depth by the art world. People like Rembrandt, Rubens, all the Dutch masters spent a lot of time working specifically on light and exploring light. And in fact, some of the lighting styles that we're going to look at have their names. The Rembrandt lighting style, for example, which is a high light coming through, a high side light. So very good for sculpturing shapes. Serious and classic. You can choose how hard you want to have the light, but we'll talk about that in a moment. But it is the direction of light that's doing all the work, is doing a big part of the work. And you can combine it with these other properties that we've already talked about. You can combine it with the intensity as well. If you have a weak light and a side light combined, it produces quite a different look from a strong light and a side light combined, for example. So it will develop shadows, and the shadows can be used as a way of developing your three-dimensionality, and also assist in the development of your negative space. Andrew Eccles, another one, who's brilliant at these kind of portraits. Oh, I forgot to mention those ones are Robert Mapplethorpe, who's another master lighting photographer. Andrew Eccles, working here with Martin Scorsese and Al Pacino, I think it is, isn't it? Yeah. And you can see, again, the use of shadows and form and really accentuating character and lines and things. Maybe not the sort of lighting you would choose necessarily if you were trying to create a very beautiful portrait, perhaps of a young woman or something like that. Perhaps you use a different style. But this is to accentuate that these people have lived, that they have experience, that they have gravitas, that they have a certain seriousness, and the classic lighting style works well for that. Often rendered in black and white to bring that out even more, because black and white really accentuates the tonal range, and the tonal range is certainly present in this style of lighting. Sebastian Salgado often uses side lighting in his portraits of people in the third world. And again, because it creates a certain mystery, a certain seriousness, a certain empathetic response, and sometimes an angelic aspect as well. Particularly there's some backlighting as well. Top lighting. It's a style of lighting that was particularly in vogue in the 30s, in the 20s and 30s. But I'm very much in favour in the movies. I think it was Greta Garbo who insisted on all of her lighting being top lighting. And what this does, as you can see, is create very accentuated cheekbones. Kind of a very accentuated, blown forehead, angelic amongst the forehead. But there's deep cheek lines here and deep shadows underneath the eyes. So there's the angel with mystery at the same time. So this is why she liked this one. Robert Mapplethorpe's also using it, developing a different idea, developing a more sculptural sort of look with his work. He's using a softer light rather than this one. So it's a softer light, perhaps less intense, a less intense light, a more spread and filtered light, this one. And Sebastian Salgado here, top light here. His top light here is the sun. And this is something that we know about. We know this look. And you can see, if you go back here, that this is kind of a version of the sun. Or a very bright light above, at least. As opposed to this one, where the lighting is much softer than the sun would produce, particularly in the shadows it's created. The sun at noon, particularly near the equator, develops extremely dark shadows, black shadows, what's known as hard light, very high contrast light. So deep downward shadows, again accentuating cheekbones, and coming directly from above and having lots of shadows here and here. That's very typical of a noonday sun. Bottom lighting, you probably know this from the campfire experience, where the lights, the torches underneath the person's chin on a campfire, and the semiotic that we readily note that this one is kind of a sinister, spooky light. It's not a light that's really used for many other purposes than this. Although sometimes it's used to develop semiotic for someone working on a computer now. That sort of lighting, that sort of personal closed space, internal closed space of someone on a laptop, for instance. And then we have backlighting as well. Backlighting can be used in a few different ways, but one of the most common ways is for effect stylization, that is this kind of silhouette look, where the form is largely rendered in black, so there's no foreground light there. If there is a foreground light, like here, then you can get this rim light effect. This one's the rim light, and backlighting will help you achieve this. Again, something to help you develop backlighting in concert with frontal lighting, helps you develop form and shape. And you can also use it to create these kind of glamorous stylizations as well, as an effect. One of the things that happens with backlighting quite often is that you will start to get spill directly into the lens from the backlight, and you'll start to get this kind of milky sort of appearance in the photograph. And that's down to a lack of contrast as the light starts bouncing around inside your lens. And you can see this has happened here. We've got a front light as well as a back light, and the back light is, although it's producing a rim effect, it's also spilling, probably because it hasn't been shaped directly. It's spilling into the lens as well. And this is something you probably experience with your own cameras when you're shooting at the sun or close to the sun. And one piece of advice I've got for that is, if you're shooting those conditions, is use your lens hood. Lots of people, when they get a camera, it's got a lens hood, they think, well, what's that? And they put it in the bag and never use it. Well, a lens hood is used precisely for that reason, to cut down on the amount of stray light that's bouncing into your lens. Stray light that's bouncing off this direction, that direction, and coming straight into your lens. And so using a lens hood can help you develop higher contrast and stronger contrast in images. Of course, sometimes you want to get this milky effect. Sometimes you want to get that kind of ethereal sort of look. So that can be part of your style. This is quite an important one, and one that takes a little, in my experience, takes people a little time to get their heads around how to generate the quality of light. And typically when we're talking about quality of light, we're talking about hard to soft. The difference between a hard light and a soft light. And there's a few things involved in doing this. We can change the size of the light source. We can change the type of light source. We can change the distance of the light source. But one way that helps people, I think, to think about the difference between hard light and soft light is to think of the example of the sun. Because the sun, on a non-cloudy day, on a sunny day, always produces a hard light, particularly in the middle of the day. You remember this image back here with the fellow in the forest? This is an example of very hard lighting. And with hard lighting, there's things that you notice. You can tell very easily what direction it's coming from. You can tell that it creates very hard and distinct and dark shadows. That the transitions between the bright areas and the dark areas is abrupt. In fact, there's almost no transition zone. You've gone from bright areas into dark areas almost immediately. There's not this kind of soft graduation or transition. And so they're the really things that characterise hard light, and it's hard sunlight that always do this. And if you think about the sun is a very powerful light source, but it's small and it's distant. So it's virtually a spotlight. And a spotlight does exactly the same thing. A spotlight in a theatre. It's a small source, it's unfiltered, but it's very powerful and it's distant. And that will create this sort of look. So to manipulate the quality of light, we can do a few things. We can change the size of the light source. We can apply diffusion. We can apply reflection. We can change the light type and change the distance of the light to the subject. So this is hard light. And this could be the sun quite easily on a sunny day, but there's things creating shadows, obviously. But what you'll notice is very hard-edged shadows, no transition zones. No areas of transitions between the dark areas and the bright areas. It just goes abruptly from bright into dark. So it's strong definition. It's very good for bringing out textures and things. It's very good for developing directionality. And it's characterised by, as I was saying, a small source, a distant source. And the semiotic is quite often hard, cruel, unforgiving, mean, tough. That's the kind of semiotic reading that is most commonly associated with this hard light. I guess that's why they call it hard light. Yeah. You could call it high contrast light. Sounds it's a little bit less loaded, but and we saw quite a bit of it in those side portraits, use of Kash, using relatively hard light there, because it does develop that definition, texture and directionality, and can develop like a tough, hard-edged, gritty, highly textural look, and you can see it's been used here to effect, brings out every little mark, scar, etc., and brings it all there for us. Does nothing to hide anything, in fact brings everything out. So not really a beautiful light, not really a beauty light. And the bare bulb will create this sort of light. And the sun is essentially that, a bare, powerful bulb. There's another example there. So when you're doing your studio skills projects, one of the things I'll be looking for you to do, depending on the semiotic that you're trying, or the meanings you're trying to develop in your projects, is to try and use light in this way. So if you're trying to create a film noir sort of look, you know, those kind of gangster type movies where there's these tough guys going around, they used typically this hard, cruel, unforgiving, mean light, this noir light. Horror films use it a lot too. It's a frightening sort of light. It's a difficult light. So this is the sort of light you would use to create these ideas and meanings. And I'm much more interested in you trying to create your semiotics using these ideas, the lighting ideas, than worrying too much about developing extended narratives or trying to be overly didactic in creating meanings by having people waving guns or sticking knives into each other and all this sort of thing. Use light to create your ideas. Okay? Let's have a look at soft diffuse light. It's the most commonly used portrait light because it, for most people, because most people want to look beautiful in their portraits. It's soft, has reduced shadows, sometimes no shadows. It's typically more difficult to determine the direction. It de-emphasises texture. And you create it by a large source, a close source, and its semiotic is beautiful. Beauty. Beautiful wrapping light. I've said nothing about colour of the light at the moment, so we'll just put that to one side for the moment. We're just talking about the softness or hardness of the light. You can get beautiful, soft wrapping light from the sun, but what it takes is a cloudy day. And in this instance, on a cloudy day, the clouds actually act like a giant softbox or filtration. So what is actually going on is that the single source is now been made into a large, single small source is now being made into a large, very large source that is spread and filtered, and that reduces directionality, it obliterates shadows, and it's much closer than the sun is. And you've probably seen that phenomenon on a cloudy day. I don't know if you've noticed, but on a cloudy day, all of a sudden there's no shadows. It's really quite odd, because you know there's plenty of light around. Where are the shadows? Where have they gone? And the reason they're not there is because the light is coming from lots of different angles instead of just one, and so the shadows have been filled in by other light. And this is the principle behind soft or diffuse light. Fill in the shadows, make the light diffused. Diffuse the light with something, usually something placed in front of the light, like a cloud. On studio lights, typically it's a thing called a softbox. One of the things that is typical of a soft diffuse light is that highlight reflections are very much reduced. You probably would have seen with your flash, when you took shots with your flash, you may have got shiny reflections in your person's face coming back at you. That's because your flash is undiffused. And to get over that problem, photographers use things called little soft boxes, and they put those over the flashes to diffuse the light, spread it, and make it more wrapping and soft. Just moving on to colour now. So this is property 4. So we've gone through intensity, gone through direction, and we've gone through quality, which is hardness, softness of light. And now we're just looking at colour. And this is really an adjunct to our white balance discussions in class. In class, we saw that we could have various selections of in our white balance setting, and this is because every type of light that you encounter has a certain colour associated with it. And that's not completely obvious to us usually, because that colour is our eyes and brain combine to make sure that we see white as white. In other words, we've got automatic white balancing going on. But our camera has that as well, and that's doing the same thing. But we can use light, the colour of light, to create different moods and create different interpretations. And we can manipulate colour by object colour itself, lens filtration, and the colour temperature of our camera. So I briefly mentioned degrees Kelvin in class, and here's the Kelvin scale here. And basically it's saying that different light sources have a different colour temperature. And when it's talking about colour temperature, it's not heat temperature. This is a scale that is independent of heat. Even though the scale looks like it has a heat idea in it, it doesn't. Okay? It's talking about warmer colours, cooler colours in relation to the look of the colour, not the actual colour, not the heat of the colour. Okay, so just want to remove that idea. You can see again the starting point, or the medium, or the middle. The standard is sunlight. That's the light that we've evolved under, and that has a Kelvin of 5,500 degrees Kelvin. So Kelvin was this Scottish polymath, a scientist who did many different things, but one of the things he did do was develop this scale of colour temperature. Now it used to be in the old days what you had to do was buy or use certain film that had a certain colour temperature to it and graded for particular types of light that you'd be working under, whether it be daylight, tungsten or flash and so on. These days we have our white balance settings, so we can change our colour temperature according to the lighting conditions that we encounter for each individual shot. But it's not just a case of setting the Kelvin temperature, it's a combination of the white balance setting in the camera in combination with the prevailing light that's going to result in the outcome. And what I encourage you to do is experiment with the colour temperatures in your camera and experiment with them against different coloured light to see what effects you can get, because some of them are unusual. Some of them create different ideas and different looks. This one here has used a very cool greenish blue colour temperature effect, and it creates a kind of, I don't know, cool inner city sort of look that kind of suits this band shot. Whereas this one has gone for a much warmer colour setting, colour effect that reflects this idea of the candles and the warmth of that particular situation. So the photographers here are using the semiotics embedded in colours to develop these ideas in the photograph. This one here, the photographer is combining the colours already in the scene and then using a cool colour cast to combine with that, so that there's a harmony between the available colours and the colours in the scene. This one, the photographer is accentuating the warmth of the afternoon sunlight and using a colour setting that's bringing that out more. One thing I should add here is that these days, if we're shooting in RAW, and you guys should all be shooting in RAW now, is that everyone doing that? Okay, we'll make sure we switch on to RAW today. If you're shooting in RAW, you can change your white balance settings later or your colour settings later, and there's no loss. There's no, you don't have any quality loss doing that. So that's one good thing about shooting in RAW. You can actually set your white balance setting later on in your editing software. So here's two different light temperatures. This is simply done by changing, you can do this in camera or changing the white balance in camera raw. You can see both of these photographs are perfectly acceptable. But they have a different reading to them. This one has a kind of a cooler, more standoffish sort of idea behind it. Something a bit more gritty and urban, a bit more punk perhaps. It brings out the blues and the dark hair a bit more, and the darkness in the sunglasses, cool tones. This one has a much more a warmer aspect, kind of a more friendly aspect, kind of more approachable aspect. So yeah, two different readings of the same photograph with two different colour settings, and both are fine. So this is how you can use it to create effect. So how can you change the colour of light? Well, you can put filters in front of your light source. That is, if you have a light source, like a source that you can, like a strobe or a flash or something like that, you can put filters in front of them. You can put filters in front of your lens. This is something photographers used to do a lot. Particularly the soft, a mild blue filter or a mild tobacco filter or something like that to give pictures a kind of a warm look. You can bounce your lights off coloured surfaces, so you could have a flash, you could bounce it off a red wall, for instance, and it'll bring back a kind of a warm light into your image. With the sun, choosing a different time of day will give you different colour in the types of colour in the light. So in the middle of the day, of course, it's usually going to be very white, bright white light, and that bright white light is in fact the mix of all colours. But at either ends of the day, you're going to get a much warmer look. And it's one of the reasons photographers like that time of day, because it's got a much warmer light. Or you can change the white balance settings, as we learned how to do, or you can change your film type. We're going to be doing some night shooting this week, and with the film types, for example, I like to do some night shooting with shooting film. And one of the things that I found is that one of the film types that works particularly well for night, produces a really nice look, is portrait film. Because portrait film has a slight warm tinge to it, and I find that works really well with my night photography. So that's just an example of how you can mix and match these things to your own effect. Just a quick word about lens filtration. And we've got filters at the loans desk, and you might also be interested in buying some of your own. Most of you have got UV reduction skylights or skylights on your lenses. They're usually there to just protect the lens, but they also have the ability to reduce blue haze that can come from UV light. And you usually see that when you're at height, up in the hills or something like that, that blue haze over the city. So those filters can reduce that. There's also graduating filters. These are filters that, like those sunglasses that are dark at the top and get gradually less dark. And the idea is they help you see, or they calm down the sky a little bit for you when you're wearing those sunglasses, but allow you to see everything at this level. Well, there's filters that do that as well, and they're specifically really designed for landscape photography so that you can bring the dynamic range of the sky into the same region as the land. So you're able to combine those two areas of dynamic difference together. And we've got those. Neutral density is kind of a grey filter. And what that does is essentially darken the available light coming in. It can be very useful for getting control over very bright lights or very bright sunlight. So for instance, if you want to do a slow shutter speed shot during the day, you might use a very strong UV neutral density filter to enable you to use slow shutter speeds and not blow out your image. Polarizers. A lot of Australian photographers like to use polarizers because they, particularly in the bright summer light, it calms, it produces extra colour and vividness because a lot of white light tends to blow out and reduce those colours. Filters nearly always reduce exposure, perhaps with the exception of the UV reduction filter. Here's an example of a polarizer here being used to both reduce reflections but also increase contrast and darken blues and things in the skies. Tend to get more details in the clouds and things in this image. I won't talk about measuring light. Suffice to say that we've got a light meter in our camera and we've been using that already to measure light, measure how strong light is, and in the next unit we'll actually be using handheld light meters to do specific light readings. Just a quick word on how that works though. Our cameras measure what's known as reflected light. So if I'm here with a camera and I'm taking, or say you've got a camera and you're taking a picture of me, the light meter is reading the light that's reflected from me back to the camera. Alright, so that's one way of doing a light meter reading. Well, these ones do it somewhat differently. They can do that way, reflectance, but they can also do another type of light reading, and that is for you to come down here with your light meter and stand next to me with it, and it will read the light that's falling on me, as opposed to the light that's being reflected off me. So it's in the same place and seeing exactly the same light. And so, of course, that's going to be more accurate, because it doesn't rely on any reflection from any colour or textural surface that I may be. It's going to be just reading the light. And similar photographers still use these type of light meters, and so do photographers as well, because they are so much more accurate. So, and that's called incidence light meter reading. Incidence light meter. So there's just a quick run through the different type of light sources there. It's something you might want to think about for your projects, because you'll have to think about how to use light, which lights. The only light you're not allowed to use for your project is the sun. So you've basically got to use artificial light for these projects so that you can control it. I realise to some extent you can control the sun, but because I want people to really use light, I'm going to rule the sun out. Okay? You've got to use artificial lights. So they can be tungsten lights, flash, all sorts of other things. Desk lamps, fall lamps, strobes, mirrors, car headlights, and so on. And we're going to have a go with torches today. Do a bit of light painting. Let's not talk about flash just now. Just wanted to go back to here. A little bit about light painting. This is what we're going to have a go at today. It's essentially where you use long exposures and then use lights to paint light into the scene, or take lights into the scene and point them back at the camera to create drawings. So we can do that. Just a quick word on three-point lighting before we leave. And there's a nice little, up on LMS, there's a nice little program there, a flash program, that you can use to experiment with your three-point lights. It basically has 3 different lights that you can turn on and off, and you can see the various different effects that it creates. But essentially, the nomenclature that we use is a key light. Again, this is our main light. It's usually emulating the idea of the sun. Not the sun, but something analogous to the sun. So we generally have one key light. It generates principal shadows. It motivates the key light source in the scene, and it's our key light for developing our narrative. So if we want a side light, it's the key light that we're going to use to generate that. Then we've got the fill light. So here's our key light here in this instance. So the photographer's put it on the right-hand side. Here's our fill light. This one, as the name suggests, is to fill in the shadows. So its purpose is not to create the main light. It is a weaker light, weaker than the main light, and usually that's expressed in terms of a ratio. This might be 2 times as powerful as this one, so that's a 2-to-1 ratio. That can be measured by a light meter. But its main job is just to fill in the shadows so that the shadows are not completely black. Now, of course, you may not necessarily have a key light, fill light at all, particularly if you're going for a very hard light. You want to accentuate those shadows. But in this instance, we have a fill light, and then there's also the backlight, typically used to create depth and rim light and make the subject stand out, and it's also a stylisation tool, as we saw. Let's go to this one quickly, although we've got to finish. So the reason we focus on three-point lighting is because it's you can do just about everything you need to do with three-point lighting. It's an extremely versatile system, and many photographers don't go beyond this. In fact, many photographers only use less than this. One light, just one simple side light, and maybe a reflector. But if you understand three-point lighting, you're well on the way to understanding lighting generally, and then can start adding, if you like, additional light sources. So what makes a key light a key light? Well, if you've only got one light, then that's obviously the key light, but generally it's the power of the light. So the key light's your most powerful light in the scene. The most powerful frontal light, I should say. Said all those things. Often it's placed at just one side of the camera and is used to develop the idea of form and shape.